can't stop thinking about Fire Emblem Three Houses. Actually, I can't even stop playing Fire Emblem Three Houses. This game has been all I've been able to think about for years, and it seems to endlessly spark my analytical imagination through the depth of its world building, story, and characters. One aspect that I've always found particularly impressive is the game's soundtrack. Composers Rei Kondo, Hiroki Moshirita, and Takeru Kanazaki did an excellent job with this soundtrack, with the music doing a great deal to enhance the narrative and gameplay experience. A couple of years ago, I released a video on musical secrets and leitmotifs in Three Houses. Since creating that video, some of my opinions on the soundtrack have changed a little. This video will thus serve as a more definitive and detailed analysis of the Three Houses soundtrack. Furthermore, I will also be including Three Hopes in my analysis. I was quite surprised to find out that Three Hopes had a different set of composers, as even outside of the remixes of familiar tracks from houses that we hear in the game, the original music written for Hopes truly feels like a natural continuation of Fodlan's already existing soundscape. It is for this reason that I will not separate my analysis of these two soundtracks in spite of their different composers, as I am of the belief that Hopes naturally built upon the foundation of houses. A leitmotif is a short musical idea or phrase that recurs throughout a score or series of scores. On the surface, this seems similar to a musical theme, which comprises a musical idea that is repeated in such a way that it is central to the identity of a piece. The distinction between a leitmotif and a theme is something that is debated by musicologists. Indeed, both are repeated, are central to developing musical identity, and both develop in such a way that we experience a sense of progress. However, a leitmotif can be best understood as distinct from a theme in that it is heavily weighted with symbolic meaning, attached to a certain character, thing, situation, symbol, or place. Sometimes leitmotifs form a part of themes, but the key to their significance in a piece of music is as a point of dramatic culmination, as a fixed musical focus that draws our attention to something important, even when it occurs within otherwise fluid musical material. The use of recurring leitmotifs in orchestral music can be traced back to the early 17th century. However, the earliest composer who has been specifically associated with the concept of the leitmotif is 19th century German composer Richard Wagner. His most famous operatic outing, The Ring Cycle, which is comprised of a series of 4 operas, used hundreds of leitmotifs, each of which were associated with characters, things, themes, or particular situations. Many of these motifs underwent drastic, dramatic progressions throughout the cycle, and really, this is what makes the leitmotif such a unique musical device, as something that is so intimately intertwined with conveying a story. The Ring Cycle is around 15 hours long, and epics of this length lend themselves very well to the use of leitmotifs. In the 20th century, leitmotifs would become a staple of many film scores. They have been especially effective in long, epic sagas that allow for much more room to develop recurring musical ideas. Think of Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings. In recent decades, they have also become more common in television. Game of Thrones, for instance, had over 50 distinct leitmotifs throughout its 8 seasons. Leitmotifs have also become a staple of video game soundtracks over the past 30 or so years. Even in the era of 8-bit and later 16-bit music, motivic scoring was already present to some extent. However, with technological advancement, composers were granted the ability to do much more with music as a storytelling device. Video game scores have now become just as extensive and rich in musical identity as the soundtracks of film and television. Gone are the days where composers were limited to the relatively minimal sound variety of chip music. Some video game series have motifs and themes that develop over the course of several games, several composers, and often over many years. For example, The Legend of Zelda has countless distinct motifs that have recurred in several different forms throughout the series' 37-year history. Conversely, other series have themes and motifs that are distinct to each game. The Tales series is a good example of this, where each game usually develops leitmotifs that are distinct from its predecessors. Indeed, in the case of Tales, there is no single musical idea that can be generally associated with the series as a whole. Fire Emblem as a series fits somewhere in between. Most games include their own themes and motifs that are distinct and unique. However, the main Fire Emblem theme is featured in every game. On that note, I will now use this theme to explain some of the ways in which composers are able to create musical variation, as this is an important aspect to understand when we more closely examine Three Houses' particularities. As aforementioned, this melody has been featured in Fire Emblem games since the very inception of the series. The variation of this theme we hear in Three Houses is perhaps one of its darkest iterations yet. The reason for this is mostly related to the tonal center of the melody. In particular, there is a notable shift from the major mode to the minor mode. Take, for example, the main theme of Awakening, which is played in G major. In this melody, we start on the 5th degree of the scale, which is D. In contrast, the variation of this theme we hear in Three Houses is in D minor, and this time we start on the root note. The notion that major modes sound happier than minor modes is a little deceptive. This is not always the case. In this instance, it is actually the degree of the scale upon which the melody is built that contributes to the overall gloomy feeling of Three Houses' main theme. Thus, even though both melodies follow a similar melodic pattern, the shift in key and the degree of the scale on which each melody starts convey two distinctly different moods. This is not the only way that composers are able to construct melodies into new variations. Continuing with the example of the Fire Emblem theme, listen to these examples. Both of these are melodic variations, in that the shape of the melody is still recognizable, but some intervals between notes have been altered. Here is another example of a melodic variation, in which intervals have not only been changed, but new notes have also been added between them. This variation also contains a modulation, which is when there is a change from one tonal center to another. This is sometimes accompanied by a change in key signature, but not always. Another way that a melody can be changed is through rhythmic variation. For example, listen to the use of syncopation here. Syncopation is when there is a stress on the offbeat as opposed to the onbeat of the bar. A musical theme can also be changed by introducing counterpoint melodies. This essentially means that there are two musical lines that are harmonically dependent on each other, but melodically independent. Here's an example from Awakening that contains not only a melodic variation of the main theme, but also a counterpoint melody. Of course, it also goes without saying that orchestration also contributes to variation. A change in timbre can serve to drastically alter what a melody conveys to the listener. These are just some examples of how variation can be achieved, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list. That said, as we discuss the way that music is used in Three Houses and Three Hopes, I will point out any elements that are relevant to the motifs we hear. The Edge of Dawn is the main theme of Three Houses. Significantly, however, it contains a couple of distinct motifs that occur independently throughout the soundtrack. One of these is Edelgard's leitmotif. This is something we can not only glean from the lyrics of The Age of Dawn, but also from its Japanese title, A Girl of Fresfelg. It is the melody of the chorus that is most strongly associated with Edelgard. In the section where I analyze this motif in greater depth, this will become very apparent. But for now, a clear example that demonstrates this motif's association with Edelgard is in the base camp themes in Three Hopes. This motif features very prominently when exploring the Scarlet Blaze base camp. Conversely, in Azure Gleam and Golden Wildfire, you never hear the chorus motif. Indeed, in Golden Wildfire, the Age of Dawn does not appear at all, while in Azure Gleam, there is a small melodic variation of this musical idea from the bridge of the song.
The blue moonlight cuts across our sight as pure and clear as a ringing bell.
This is actually kind of cool, as that's the line in The Age of Dawn that directly references the blue moonlight of Azure Moon. There are exceptions to the Edelgard rule, such as in the various Awakening battle themes in Hopes, which all feature different remixes of the entirety of The Age of Dawn. Similarly, we hear a variation of it in Fodlan Winds. However, I will be placing less emphasis on these outliers when I focus on Edelgard in the next section. Instead, I will primarily explore how the motif develops in relation to her character and what she represents in the narrative. The melody of the verse of The Age of Dawn also acts as a motif, and it appears more frequently and more generally than Edelgard's motif throughout the soundtrack.
Lights pass through colored glass in this beloved place. Silver shines, the world dines, a smile on each face.
It is so prolific that analyzing each and every one of its appearances would take up half the video, so for the sake of brevity, here are just a few standout examples. From the ease and relaxation of wandering around Garrukmark Monastery during white clouds, to the melancholy of broken routine that we hear after Geralt's death, to the twisted intensity of facing Epimenides towards the end of Three Hopes, really this melody is used in such a variety of contexts that it is not strongly representative of any one thing in the game, and is instead mostly used to convey more general moods to the player. It will, of course, come up again later in this video, as it is so prolific. In the narrative, I would posit that Edelgard's leitmotif not only represents her character, but also the symbolism she most embodies. Thus, in order to understand the use of her motif fully, it is important to first examine the symbolism. The other name of the Edge of Dawn, because yes, this song has so many names, is Seasons of Warfare, which is strongly related to the Japanese title of the game, Fukasetsu Getsu, Wind, Flower, Snow, Moon. The name derives from a metonym, Setsugetsu, in which the themes of snow, moon, and flower represent winter, autumn, and spring respectively. In the context of Three Houses, an additional character for wind was added to represent the missing season, summer. Of course, we see this represented in the four roots of houses. However, what's more interesting is the symbolism associated with this metonym. The metonym has several interpretations, but it essentially emphasizes embracing life's chances and changes, and highlights that beautiful things don't last forever, just like the passing of the seasons. Some interpretations also suggest that the things that do not change or are stagnant are inherently decadent and corrupt. There is, of course, a metaphorical change of seasons when Edelgard ushers in a continent-wide war. Regardless of how one feels about the greyness of her morality, she is the season changer, she is the character who shatters the stagnation of the world. I think that is why this song, whether we know it as Seasons of Warfare or A Girl of Hresvelg or The Edge of Dawn, is so focused on Edelgard. And if one really listens to The Edge of Dawn, it becomes apparent that the lyrics aren't about Edelgard as a hero, but Edelgard as a tragic character. She longs for peace and to stay still, and yet she is the arbiter of war and destruction. I always say that a good way to understand what was intended for Edelgard in this narrative is to think of her like a wildfire. The change she embodies is rapid and destructive, but what's left in its wake essentially depends on whether Edelgard is narratively framed as an antagonist or a protagonist. Does the change she brings scorch the world or cleanse it? As we'll see, her leitmotif shifts accordingly depending on the symbolic framing. We hear the lightest and most carefree rendition of this motif at the monastery during White Clouds. Much like many other versions of this motif, it is in a minor key, in this case E minor. As aforementioned, it is a bit of a misconception that major keys automatically make a piece sound happy and minor keys make it sound sad. This is not always the case, and I think that this is a very good example of this phenomenon. Indeed, what contributes to the relaxed ease of this variation is the change in rhythm and the instrumentation. The use of staccato notes gives it this light, airy feeling. Additionally, the glockenspiel gives it a very cute, innocent feeling. This melody really embodies the fleeting peace of White Clouds, the calm before the storm, if you will. Despite her ultimate goal, Edelgard truly enjoyed her time at the Officers' Academy, as she states in a conversation during her route, and as is implied by the lyrics of The Edge of Dawn. But then, when she declares war on the Church of Seros, we hear a melodic variation of the motif in The Leader's Path. There is a stark and sudden change in instrumentation here. We now hear the lower brass section of the orchestra, with much heavier percussion in the snare drum and timpani. It's militaristic and aggressive. the change in both musical tone and narrative direction is immediately felt. Regardless of the route you play, the most notable reappearance of this motif after Edelgard's declaration of war comes at the start of the time skip, in every single route. Is one of the most melancholic renditions of this motif. Its appearance here is significant because it signals to us, as the players, the extent to which the world has changed in the past 5 years. It gives gravitas and weight to the time skip. Even when it appears in Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, it communicates quite clearly that Edelgard's actions have brought dire and dramatic consequences to the world, especially in the case of Dimitri, who has been driven to madness. If you follow either of these routes, you will once again hear Edelgard's motif during the second battle at Granda Field, in Between Heaven and Earth. Before the battle, we hear this tense tremolo in the strings, with an echo of the verse motif of the Edge of Dawn played eerily on the piano. Here, Edelgard is framed as the primary aggressor. Hear Edelgard's leitmotif in full force, and the way it is orchestrated, mostly using the brass section of the orchestra once again, gives it a very severe and aggressive character in this context. This is highly effective musical storytelling. During the first battle of the Eagle and Lion in White Clouds, Edelgard's leitmotif is noticeably absent from what is essentially the same piece of music, played in a different key. In Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, Edelgard no longer needs to hide her true intentions, and we hear the full force of her resolve. Something quite similar occurs in Three Hopes, but this time it happens in Scarlet Blaze. We experience quite a different musical framing that positions Edelgard as far more heroic. Before the battle, we begin with this gentle and measured version of her motif, which is played by the woodwind section of the orchestra. It then builds up through a climbing melodic variation in the string section until we once again hear the full motif in the battle. This is a great example of how the composers were able to reshape this melody around Edelgard's very different narrative positionality, depending on the lens through which we are perceiving her. Another good example of this is how the Apex of the World is both Edelgard's hero song and at the same time her villain song, depending on whether you are playing Crimson Flower or Azure Moon. What I like about about this track is that it very much represents Edelgard's resolve, no matter the context in which you hear it. I really do enjoy that the two most opposing roots and houses, in both narrative and thematic direction, have the same final battle music, and that it works no matter whether Edelgard is a heroic emperor or a hegemonic tyrant. I still don't really know how to feel about the Apex of the World being reused in Azure Gleam's final map too, because Edelgard really loses all of her agency in that route, which kinda isn't great for her overall symbolism. On that topic, however, in the routes in which Edelgard meets tragedy, we hear much darker variations of her motif. For example, in Azure Gleam, which is honestly the route in which Edelgard meets a fate much worse than death in my opinion, we hear this very twisted version of her motif when Talus turns her into the hegemon against her will. Similarly, when she meets her death in every route other than her own in houses, we hear Unfulfilled again. I believe the most effective iteration of this particular variation comes at the end of Azure Moon, with Dimitri's character arc effectively ending with the tragedy of Edelgard's unfulfilled dreams. In this scene, she still demonstrates her strong resolve right until the end. The way I interpret the dagger throw is that Edelgard is cutting her path by forcing Dimitri's hand, so to speak. She effectively chooses to die. This is interesting to consider in relation to Azure Gleam's ending, where she is stripped of much of that agency that made her such an interesting antagonist in Azure Moon. Her motif does not appear here at all, and I think that says a lot for how far gone she is. On the other hand, if you follow Edelgard's route in Crimson Flower or Scarlet Blaze and see her victory, the music tells a very different story. We of course hear the most triumphant version of her motif in A World for Humanity at the end of Crimson Flower. I love the setting of this final scene a lot. It fits so wonderfully with Edelgard's symbolism. She emerges victorious amidst the rubble and the flames of the old world. Byleth is essentially reborn anew by Sothis' sacrifice, just as the world will now undergo its own rebirth. I love that we hear her motif on the glockenspiel again here. It of course echoes a promise in how peaceful it sounds. I also really appreciate the attention to detail in the credits music of Crimson Flower. In every other route, we hear The Edge of Dawn, which has lyrics that, as aforementioned, are focused on the tragedy and demise of Edelgard. However, in Crimson Flower, we hear The Color of Sunrise. Dawn finally breaks for Edelgard and for Fodlan. Scarlet Blaze's ending scene is quite a bit more subdued than Crimson Flower. Of course, most would agree that pretty much every ending in Three Hopes feels a little unfinished. But what I find quite amusing is that Edelgard's leitmotif doesn't actually resolve at the end of Scarlet Blaze. Listen to how it lingers on its final note, never actually completing the melody we have become so familiar with. I don't know, I find that quite funny. Something that I wish I had also mentioned in my original video of this topic is that a very similar version of Edelgard's leitmotif also appears during the ending of Verdant Wind. Initially, I had brushed this off, believing that its presence here was just because the melody is also part of the main theme of the game. But then I heard it here. Now, I'm not saying that Claude is Edelgard, but I would like to provide my interpretation of this. We know that on one hand this motif represents Edelgard, but as already discussed, it also represents the theme of change that Edelgard's character embodies. Claude is also a character who comes to embody this to some extent. Although their methods differ, Edelgard and Claude actually have a remarkably similar vision for the future. Obviously in Three Hopes it's very clear why we would hear Edelgard's motif in Melody of Clarity, because the two characters actually work together towards a common goal, never mind the fact that Claude is also defeating the Immaculate One. But even in Verdant Wind, there is a sense that Claude at least partially carries on whatever legacy Edelgard leaves behind. He even states that he will do as much. So the fact that Verdant Wind ends on a similarly triumphant note, using this very significant leitmotif, really seems to emphasize similar ideas of change, rebirth, and a new dawning. Nevertheless, it goes without saying that this motif is very well developed throughout both games, and used in some very clever and subtle ways to reinforce the narrative. It will actually come up again later in this essay because it is so prolific, and the way it interacts with other motifs is very interesting. This motif, which is most associated with Sothis, Byleth, and specifically the spirit or dream world in which Byleth interacts with Sothis, is an excellent example of how a motif need not be melodic. In this case, there is no true melody here. The motif rests upon a single pitch. This motif has two distinct versions with slightly different rhythms. Note that the second version shifts up a whole tone. Though there is no melody, it is the chanting rhythm that gives this motif its distinct musical identity. We still, of course, get a sense of the tonal center of the motif through the ostinato and chords that accompany it. In its first form here, it is played in G sharp minor. For the most part, when we hear this motif reappear in the soundtrack, it is largely unchanged in its rhythmic structure. For example, listen to this direct quotation of the second motif in The Apex of the World. This motif's lack of melody has a unique advantage when it comes into contact with other motifs or themes. It is much easier to consolidate this rhythmic motif with other melodies. For example, listen to this variation in which it interacts with the main Fire Emblem theme, almost like a counterpoint melody. Sometimes we do hear rhythmic variations, such as in this example. Even with the variation in rhythm, the motif is still clearly identifiable thanks to the use of the same choral chant that we are familiar with. One of the most interesting variations of this motif occurs during the scene in which Byleth awakens to Sothis' power. We once again shift up a whole tone into the second version of the motif, but this time there is a dissonant harmony and rhythm created, as the first motif on C sharp is played in unison with the second one on D sharp. Note that in order to clearly demonstrate the rhythmic differences, I have scored them an octave apart in my transposition, even though in actuality they are in the same register. As these two notes are only a whole tone apart, they harmonically clash. In other words, there is tonal dissonance. Moreover, what was once a soft ostinato that pattered in the backdrop of the spirit dais is now at the forefront of the score, forming a melody over the rhythmic motif. Overall, while hardly prolific, I believe that this motif is one that is very recognizable and effective when it does appear, largely due to its emphasis on rhythm rather than melody. This is the musical idea we hear whenever the Agarthans appear in the story. It is comprised of two falling melodies which are identical in pitch but different in rhythm. The use of semitone intervals and repetition makes this melody sound particularly tense. Usually, these two variations are layered on top of each other and played an octave apart, or in some cases the one leads into the other. Something that makes this motif unique is that we mostly hear it played on electronic instruments. There are of course exceptions to this, such as the previous example, and it's definitely dependent on context. That said, the stylistic use of synthesizers really serves to distinguish the Agarthans and their technology from the rest of Fodlan. The Agarthans are definitely less fantasy and more sci-fi, and I think the music very intentionally highlights this. For example, listen to this melodic variation we hear when they send javelins of light down from space, I guess? When we infiltrate Shambhala in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, we hear this dubstep remix of the motif. This, of course, is nothing like any of the other music we hear in the soundtrack. I think this use of electronic instrumentation is most effective as a storytelling device when we hear it interact with other melodies that are played on more traditional instruments. Listen, for example, to the contrast in timbre in this scene when Rhea attempts to thwart an approaching Agarthan javelin. The electronic sounds are immediately drowned out by the orchestra as soon as Rhea jumps into action. In Three Hopes, the motif of course makes a return. Whenever Shez is in the void with Arvel, you don't hear the melody of the motif, but you hear the rhythm in the percussion. It's a tiny musical clue for those of us who have played Three Houses and know that rhythm all too well. I particularly like the variation of Arvel's void music that we hear in Zaharas, where a hint of Sothis' motif appears. I think this perhaps symbolizes how the light of Fodlan has been quite literally sucked into the darkness. It could also be a nod to the last time we were in Zaharas, when Byleth awakened to Sothis' power. It's truly a pity that Byleth isn't around for these secret chapters, but I digress. This really leads us into what I regard as the best example of the Agarthan motif being used to great effect in musical storytelling. The music we hear throughout the Zaharas chapter is a wonderful coming together of several familiar motifs. Each phase of the fight slowly increases in intensity. Here are just a few highlights that I think are worth exploring. In Darkness, we only hear two motifs, a direct quotation of the Agarthan motif and a melodic variation of Edelgard's motif. In this phase, there is a very clear difference in instrumentation between these two motifs. In Holy Ground, the density of the melodies we hear increases. Now we hear 4 motifs. The 2 new motifs that are added to the mix are Sothis' motif and the Fire Emblem theme. Finally, in Abyss, we hear 5 motifs. Specifically, we hear the verse motif of the Age of Dawn added in. The motifs in this final phase blend together seamlessly. It's non-stop and unrelenting. I won't take up too much of the video showing you this, as I believe it's something best experienced in full without me chopping it up into smaller bits and pieces. So I really do encourage you to do a close listening in your own time. Interestingly, we hear much less of the Agarthan motif in this phase, and when we do hear it, it's not actually played on electronic instruments anymore. As Epimenides weakens, so too does the strength of this motif. What I really like about each phase of this fight is how the music is essentially in conversation with itself, or perhaps even doing battle with itself. We hear a variety of new melodic and rhythmic variations of familiar motifs. We hear the contrast between traditional and electronic instruments, as if the Agarthan motif is competing with all of the other motifs. We also hear more complicated elements where motifs are layered on top of each other. There is just so much going on here, and it is satisfyingly effective in conveying the absolute hype of this battle. I mean, I honestly felt like this was the final boss, even though it wasn't. And I think that a lot of that is thanks to the music. Rhea's motif develops in some interesting ways throughout the soundtrack. It uses a pentatonic scale structure, which gives it quite a different sound when compared to some of the other melodies in the game, most of which make use of diatonic scales. Pentatonic scales are in many ways quite neutral in the way they sound. The absence of semitone and tritone intervals means that there is less overall harmonic tension to be found when constructing a pentatonic melody or chord. Quite a few people have already noted that this motif sounds very Japanese, and indeed it does. The Japanese scale is a pentatonic scale. I think that the departure from the diatonic scale structure is quite effective from the perspective of musical world-building, as it helps to distinguish Rhea and the Nabateans from not only the humans of Fodlan, but also the Agarthans. This theme also constitutes one of only 2 instances of diegetic music in the soundtrack, the other being the music we hear during the Night of the Ball. Diegetic music is different from incidental music in that it can be heard by the characters themselves in their world. Rhea actually sings this motif in the form of the Song of the Nabateans in the game. We hear it once when she thinks no one is listening, and later when she sings it to Byleth. Thus, this melody is effectively a Nabatean lullaby within the actual lore of the game. This diegetic quality adds a whole layer of meaning to it. It represents Rhea's hope to resurrect her mother Sothis and reclaim what she has lost. It's her nostalgic connection to the past. It's a melody that actually has great importance to her as a character, beyond us as the audience merely associating it with her. This motif undergoes several variations throughout Three Houses, but unfortunately makes less of a splash in Three Hopes. In White Clouds, we mostly hear the melody when the mysteries of the Church of Seros are either portrayed or discussed in some manner. The motif only really begins to undergo change at the end of White Clouds, when we hear this variation when Rhea transforms into the Immaculate One for the first time. This variation is quite effective in transforming this ordinarily peaceful melody into something much more tense and aggressive, mostly thanks to the much heavier orchestration. I think the word I would use to describe the mood of this track is spiraling. Like, you just get this sense of things slowly unraveling all around you. When the Immaculate One reunites with Byleth in this scene, her motif reappears. But when it reaches its final cadence, it is suddenly interrupted by the blasting of the Agarthan motif, and then just the smallest hint of Edelgard's motif. Take a listen. I love the juxtaposition in the orchestration here between the soft melancholy of the string section and the harsh ferocity of the lower brass section. Rhea's motif, of course, undergoes its most significant developments in Silver Snow. Its next notable appearance is in the scene after Shambhala. Something interesting here is that we see this scene twice, in both Verdant Wind and Silver Snow. However, the music in the scene is different depending on the route. In Verdant Wind, the Agarthan motif really dominates. Conversely, in Silver Snow, we hear Rhea's motif much more prominently, framing the scene in quite a different way. In Silver Snow, you much more intensely feel the emotional weight behind Rhea's actions. Her sacrifice is much more visceral. This, I think, is a really nice little detail, and it shows that a lot of care and thought was put into the soundtrack. Of course, we hear the full culmination of this motif in A Funeral with Flowers. This piece really captures the intermingling of both Rhea's gentleness and her monstrousness. This is particularly evident in the contrast between the thunder and rain versions of the track. In all of the other battle themes, the thunder variation is more intense, but not here. Instead, whenever we go into battle, we hear a lonely solo piano, showing us that beneath the monstrous form of the Immaculate One, Rhea is still hurting. I also really love that we hear this counterpoint variation that incorporates Edelgard's motif, because indeed, the irony is that we are forced to battle the very being that Edelgard could not defeat herself. I think this is particularly meaningful in Silver Snow because one spends so much time with Edelgard early on in the route before she becomes an enemy. A Funeral of Flowers returns in Three Hopes, and honestly, it's really only one of two contexts in which we hear Rhea's motif reappear. the other being in Melody of Clarity, which is rather unfortunate. The motif appears in both Scarlet Blaze and Golden Wildfire, and is noticeably less nuanced, in the sense that it is clearly intended to sound frantic and villainous. Returning to houses, however, we end Silver Snow with wailing. This soft piano rendition of this motif signals to us neither triumph nor terror, but tragedy, as Rhea dies in Byleth's arms. Yes, I know if you support her, she lives, but for the purpose of my analysis of musical storytelling, it's really significant that we hear this melody, which is so representative of Rhea's hope to see her mother again, play when she dies in the arms of Sothis' vessel, especially considering that she even perceives Byleth to be Sothis in this moment. Overall, I only wish we got to hear more of this motif in Hopes. It's one of the best in the soundtrack, in my opinion.
Alas, if only we got a church route.
In this revised video on the music of Fodlan, I wanted to dive a bit more in depth about what makes the music we associate with Claude so unique and effective in painting a picture of who he is, and specifically where he's from. I wouldn't necessarily call the music we associate with Claude motivic, and so I won't focus too heavily on motif and the development of melody, as for the most part I do not believe that Claude really has a strong leitmotif. Instead, I would say that his music is used as a tool for world building. World building through music helps us to distinguish between different regions or domains through different timbres or scale structures. This can be achieved by using real-world instruments that are geographically or culturally specific. All of the music we hear that represents him or Elmira uses completely different instrumentation when compared to the rest of the game. The instrumentation that we hear in the majority of the soundtrack is predominantly Western. Conversely, Claude's music uses non-Western instruments. We often hear what I believe to be a daf, which is a type of frame drum that is used in music across the Arabian Peninsula and also in Central and South Asia. We also hear what sounds like a mizmar. This is a type of double-reeded wind instrument, a relative of the oboe. Even when Western instruments are used, they are played in particularly distinct ways when compared to the rest of the score. For example, we hear a lot of what I do believe to be just an ordinary violin. However, the way it is played is very reminiscent of the style and technique of some traditional Middle Eastern string instruments, such as the Persian kamanche or the Turkish tambur. Another familiar instrument that shifts in timbre is the trumpet, which is instead played with a mute. choice to include these timbres in Claude's music tells us so much without the game having to tell us anything directly. And I think this is where the strength of musical world building lies. It really reinforces showing instead of telling in the narrative. Much of what we can glean about Elmira comes from subtle little hints like this, and I think this subtlety is quite intentional. Claude keeps his cards close to his chest, and yet we still get a sense of his Elmiran identity through his music. This becomes all the more effective when coupled with everything else we slowly find out about Elmira, with the region's nomenclature mostly having Arabic influences, Claude's final class being called Barbarossa, which was the sobriquet of a famous pirate and admiral of the Ottoman fleet in the 16th century, Elmiran armor looking to be very Ottoman-inspired, especially in textures and silhouette. I could really go on. Overall, my only gripe is that we don't hear more of this Elmiran music in Claude's big story moments, though I suppose that speaks more to a general problem with Elmiran lore being shafted in the narrative anyway. I'm looking at you, Golden Wildfire. But nevertheless, I really do appreciate the moments when we do hear music like this, because it does so much in making the world feel not only diverse, but also particularly real and alive. In my original essay a couple of years ago, I tried to trace the melodies in Dimitri's theme in Three Houses, King of Lions, across his route. I specifically focused on the similarities between this theme and the music we hear in the final cutscene of Azure Moon. While I still stand by some of my assertions and inferences in that video, Three Hopes really made me reevaluate whether his music is motivic at all. I do think that a lot of this imbalance between character leitmotifs in the game is because of how prolific the Edge of Dawn generally is, though this is not to say that there is nothing to analyze with Dimitri's music. King of Lions is a very dark, resolute theme, and I think it does a pretty good job of representing Dimitri as a character, especially since the first time we hear it is post-time skip. What does stand out to me is how disjointed and dissonant parts of this piece sound. For example, this counterpoint ostinato is very dissonant. There is also this constant low A that carries throughout the piece, not really moving in any particular melodic or harmonic direction. It's kind of ominous and eerie, and the piece only starts to feel truly harmonic in this section. Actually quite interesting to me, because even if there aren't very many super obvious variations of these melodies elsewhere, Dimitri seems to tend towards having these different falling melodies. Here are some other examples. Much like King of Lions, the Azure Gleam camp theme also has a bunch of chordal dissonance, and generally is quite weird in structure. It has a lot of really long melodies. For example, the song begins with this long falling melody that then slowly climbs back up, and it is 16 bars of just long notes without much diversity in rhythmic structure. So what does it all mean, really? I am of the belief that the absence of a strong melodic structure can be very revealing, from the chordal dissonance to this tendency towards falling melodies, and the overwhelming use of the brass section of the orchestra as well. It all really paints a picture of Dimitri and his mental state. The fact that King of Lions appears much less after Dimitri turns the corner with his mental health in Azure Moon really does support this idea. Further, I think it's worth mentioning that Dimitri is Edelgard's foil. They were intentionally designed by the writers to be opposites in many ways. So for their music to also feel very oppositional is actually really apt. With Edelgard, you have this emphasis on structured melody, whereas with Dimitri, there is less structure and more dissonance. As I said, I do still stand by most of what I said in my original video, but I am no longer of the belief that Dimitri has a strong, identifiable leitmotif. This is a bit of a pity, but much like with Claude, I think it's mostly okay, as his music is still distinct enough to represent him as a character. Apart from the more prolific motifs that I have covered thus far in this video, the soundtracks of Three Houses and Three Hopes also contain several smaller, miscellaneous motifs that appear less frequently but are still recognizable enough that they warrant mentioning. Firstly, there are a couple of small motifs that are confined to the DLC story. This is the first one. What I like about this motif is that it is actually a melodic variation of the verse motif of The Age of Dawn. It is not the verse motif perfectly in reverse, like what we hear in the Shackled Wolves. Instead, it is rhythmically exactly the same, but the melody climbs instead of falls. Have a listen to how it compares to A Long Road, which is in the same key as The Forgotten. I think this is quite clever musical storytelling. The motif represents the abyss, which is the parallel or even inverse of Garreg-Mach Monastery. We of course hear this motif in the final boss music of Cindered Shadows. The second motif from the DLC story is this one. This is the motif of the Ashen Wolves. It features very prominently throughout Shackled Wolves, it also makes a return in At What Cost. It usually has such a jazzy, relaxed feel to it, and I really like how it becomes so operatic here. There's a real gravitas to it. One of the very first musical ideas we hear in the game is this one. This is the leitmotif of Nemesis. We hear it again here when Nemi wakes up from his 1,000-year nap. Features very prominently throughout God-Shattering Star. While it it doesn't undergo any major developments, it is still recognizable enough for the player to go, oh yeah, that's Nemesis. Another motif we hear a couple of times is this ostinato from Fodlan Winds. We also do hear some quite nice melodic variations. Another motif that reappears a few times is this chordal progression, which forms a part of the main theme. It is directly quoted in most of its appearances. Again, much like with Nemesis's motif, it doesn't undergo any super major changes, but I think it is still recognizable enough to be considered a motif in its own right. This video has hopefully demonstrated the depth of meaning embedded in the music of Three Houses and Three Hopes, with a greater emphasis on music theory than my last foray into this topic. Thank you very much for watching. It was a very big project, especially with all of the transposition I did, but I greatly enjoyed the process. If you have any suggestions for game soundtracks that you would like me to analyze in this format in the future, please do leave a comment down below. I am currently working hard at writing an essay on the music of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and I was also recently blown away by the music of Final Fantasy XVI, so those two games are definitely on the horizon for the channel. Because yes, I am officially back from my hiatus, I hope. And of course, links to the Discord server and my Twitter are in the description if you would like to see me yelling about JRPGs. Thank you again.